Hello everyone, welcome back to our lectures for Geography 101, Earth Systems. Today we're going to be talking all about hydrothermal topography, like this beautiful hot spring that we see here. So hydrothermal features are just landscapes that are formed by the heating of water by the Earth's crust. You can see here you have groundwater infiltrating into an area and then flowing towards a heat source, usually a magma body, and then getting heated, and then a number of features forming as a result. The most famous of which is most likely Yellowstone National Park. And Yellowstone is actually a hotspot, just like we talked about for Hawaii. And that hotspot has been staying still as the North American plate has been moving to the north or southwest. And so the remnants of that hotspot can be seen all the way from western Nevada all the way up to Wyoming, where it's currently located. And so that hotspot brought up a lot of hot magma from the mantle and has caused the crust to deform as a result. So you have spreading of the Earth's crust, and that spreading causes the formation of fractures and that ground to collapse underneath it as the Earth's crust moves away from that location. And those fractures allow for water to infiltrate into the ground and get closer to this magma body, this granitic magma chamber, and get heated and form a lot of interesting features. Those features include geysers, fumaroles, hot springs, and mud pots that we're going to be talking about today. So first, let's talk about hot springs. Hot springs can be extremely relaxing, and I highly recommend visiting one if you ever have the chance. So hot springs are just surface water that has been heated by underground magma. So you can see a diagram of them here. You just have a network of groundwater chambers that extends down close enough to the magma in order to get heated, and then that hot water then comes up and reaches the surface. And so this can happen as a single channel forming a hot spring, or kind of seep through several smaller holes, having a hot seep, and will form a thermal pool, which is this pool on the surface with hotter than normal water temperatures. And we see a map here of all the different hot springs in the United States. And it's really striking to see how many there are on the west compared to the east. The vast majority of hot springs are located in the western states, west of Colorado. And you can see here the temperatures are indicated in the color here. So some of the hottest hot springs are in the Nevada region. Another interesting thing about hot springs is that they can have algal growth in them. That's what caused the color that we saw in the intro slide. So the algae that grow in hot springs are known as extremophiles. They're extremophiles because they've adapted to the extreme temperature and also the extreme chemical concentrations in these waters. And as a result, they can have some really important genes that are important for scientific study, but also for medicine or plant development. For example, we can take the heat resistance genes from algae and use GMO technology to incorporate those into certain plants and make those plants more resistant to higher temperatures due to climate change. And so you can see here all the extreme different colorations that the rock can take because of these algal growths. The temperature of the hot spring changes depending on how far away you are from it, and so different types of algal communities can grow as a result. The next feature that we're going to be talking about are geysers. This is Old Faithful in Yellowstone. And so geysers are hot springs, but that have also intermittent boiling. And so that water gets so hot that it forms steam underground. And that steam causes a column of water to shoot out from the location that it's coming out of. So you have groundwater filling into this chamber, um, going into these larger areas and forming steam. And as that steam builds up pressure, then it explodes outwards. And you can see that here in this animation. So you have water filling this chamber where it then gets heated by the magma until it gets superheated and boils. And then that pressure that builds up as a result allows the water to erupt out of that location. There are two different types of geysers. There's cone geysers and there's fountain geysers. Old Faithful being a good example of a fountain geyser. A cone geyser forms when you have high mineral concentrations in the water that's coming out of the ground. And as a result, you have deposition that occurs as the water comes up. It's kind of like some of the features that we talked about with caves, that you have deposition occurring and a mound or a sinter forming as a result. You can see that here, these mounds that result as you have deposition of the water coming out. Whereas Old Faithful, for example, ends in a pool that most of that water washes away, and so you don't have that deposition occurring. We can look at the distribution of geysers throughout the world, and there's really not that many. Geysers are very unique features that require very specific conditions. And so there's about 30 different locations on Earth that have geysers. Many of these locations have multiple geysers. But yeah, so they're all distributed throughout areas with tectonic plate boundaries or hotspots. Here's Yellowstone, for example. And so there are definitely interesting features that are a rarity throughout the world. Next, let's talk about fumaroles. So fumaroles are very potentially dangerous and very interesting features. So there are areas of the Earth's crust where you have an opening that emits large amounts of steam or gas. Usually a fumarole has some sort of geologic geometry so that you have a funneling of these ascending gases. And the fumarole is the opening of the crust that allows these gases to escape. Here's an example of a fumarole that I witnessed in Iceland. Let's take a look. Yeah, so you can see there the large amount of steam that comes out. These can sometimes be very loud features as the gas that seeps out kind of causes a cacophony. But yeah, the gases can be a wide variety of types as well. You can see here that this is a fumarole that's forming out of a fracture that has high concentrations of sulfur. That can make the gas very acidic and also form this yellow deposits of sulfur around the opening. And then next, we'll talk about mud pots. So mud pots are also a very interesting geothermal feature. And so they're when a hot spring has a low water supply. And so instead of flowing out as water, it's only able to produce this pool of mud. Additionally, mud pots have ascending gases just like fumaroles do. And as these gases flow into this mud pool, it bubbles up and releases these gases. These gases, such as carbon dioxide and hydrogen sulfide, tend to be very acidic. Remember, carbon dioxide dissolved in water forms carbonic acid, and so the pools of mud tend to be very corrosive, very acidic, and not places that you want to hang out unless you're at a safe distance. And you can see an example of a mud pot here. Yeah, so those are the gases that are bubbling up through this mud pot, which has it's just like a hot spring, but it's not enough water to flow and wash all these muds away. Sometimes these mud pots can have high concentrations of certain minerals, such as barium or iron, that cause the coloration to change. So here's a white mud pot, as well as a kind of pinkish color mud pot. And when they take on these colors, other than brown, we call them paint pots because they look like they're made up of paint. And then the last hydrothermal feature that we're going to be talking about are hydrothermal vents. So these are fissures in areas of the seafloor, so they're underwater, where you have superheated water coming out and releasing that heat and minerals dissolved into that water. So you can see an example of a hydrothermal vent here, deep under the seafloor, that's releasing this hot water and minerals. Let's learn about hydrothermal vents in this video here. Yeah, so as the video said, hydrothermal vents can be extremely hot and produce very interesting topography and host a wide range of interesting biology. So just like a hydrothermal feature on land, a hydrothermal vent is formed when water seeps in through cracks in the ocean floor. And so you can see here this water seeping in, getting heated by this magma and coming up, and coming out of the seafloor with temperatures up to 350 Celsius, so very hot. And as it does, it emits this plume of black smoke, and this black smoke can have high concentrations of CO2, hydrogen sulfide, methane, iron, manganese, helium, and as those minerals come out, they fall out and deposit around the area, producing fallout and very rich sediments that can host a wide range of ecosystems because of that mineral-rich soil that develops. We can see a map here of all the hydrothermal vents that we've discovered. hydrothermal vents were only first discovered in 1977. So this map is most likely incomplete because we're still searching the seafloor. But we can see here that hydrothermal vents are mainly found along plate boundaries. We can see a lot of them in the Pacific, along that plate boundary, as well as in the mid-Atlantic ridge. And so, yeah, they're found all over the world because of geologic activity under the seafloor. And so as you move away from a hydrothermal vent, the temperature and chemistry of the water changes significantly. And as a result, you can have large changes in the biology of the animals around it. So as you're on the hydrothermal vent and temperatures are very high and the concentration of minerals such as sulfur are very high, then the majority of the animals living there are getting their diet from chemosynthetic processes. So they're using the sulfur and other minerals in order to produce energy instead of using sunlight, for example. And as you move further away, as we move, for example, 100 meters away, only 25 to 50% of the organisms are using chemosynthetic processes. And then as you move kilometers away, then close to none of the organisms are using the chemistry of the hydrothermal vent for their biology. So there's two different types of hydrothermal vents. There's black smokers, which are a lot more common, and black smokers have high concentrations of iron sulfide, and that iron produces that black color. And there's also white smokers. So white smokers have higher concentrations of barium, calcium, and silicon that give it that white color that you can see here. And as we've talked about, hydrothermal vents produce some really interesting biology in ecosystems. We have the tube worms that are maybe the most characteristic of hydrothermal vents, but also you can have clams and even large macroinvertebrates such as octopus and crabs, and yeah, and also a wide range of bacteria and algae and single-celled organisms that are chemotrophs. They use the chemicals available from the hydrothermal vent for their energy production. All right, so then the last thing that we're going to be talking about today in terms of hydrothermal topography is geothermal power. Geothermal power is definitely an important energy source, a renewable energy source, and so it's important to know how it's made and how significant it is. So geothermal power usually pumps cold water into a area of groundwater where you have geothermal heating, so it's close to a magma body, and then it pumps out that water and uses the steam in order to run a turbine, and then that turbine generates electricity. So these don't necessarily have to be large geothermal power plants. Instead, the majority of geothermal power goes to heating individual homes. You can see here that there's multiple different types of geothermal home heating systems. And they use the fact that the soil temperature tends to stay fairly constant throughout the year. As a result, the soil tends to be cooler than the air in the summer and warmer than the air in the winter. And you can use that fact in order to keep your home at a comfortable temperature. And so the four different types of geothermal home heating systems there are open loop system, where you're just pumping water into the ground and then having a second well where you're pumping water out. You can have a closed loop system. So there's two different types. There's a vertical closed loop system where you're putting in coils vertically into the ground, and then water is pumped continuously through those coils, and then used to heat or cool your home. So vertical coils, usually when you have not a lot of space and needs to go into the ground for more of that length, or a horizontal closed loop system when you have a wider space and don't need to dig as deep to um, to heat those coils. And then lastly, there's a closed loop system on a lake or pond. If you have a lake or pond near your property, you can just throw a bunch of coils in a closed loop system into that pond and use the fact that that pond most likely won't freeze during the winter in order to heat your home as you pump water through those coils. We can see here that hydropower for energy production has been increasing, especially since the 1980s. We have a large push in the amount of hydrothermal power that's available, from just a few thousand megawatts up to several thousand. We can see here that the U.S. currently produces about 3.6 megawatts of hydrothermal power per year, and it's one of the leading producers of hydrothermal power, followed by Indonesia, the Philippines, Turkey, and New Zealand, areas that have a lot of geothermal potential due to their geography. If we look at a map here, this is the potential for geothermal resources throughout the United States. And so the states that have magma or heat sources that are close to the surface have the highest potential for geothermal power production. And so you can see here that states like Nevada, Colorado, and Idaho have a lot of potential heat that can be extracted. One of the good things about geothermal power too is that it's fairly cheap. So the amount of money needed per megawatt hour is fairly low. It's lower than rooftop solar, for example, but not as low as wind or solar power plants. And so it's definitely a competitive renewable energy source compared to some energy such as nuclear power or coal that tends to be a little bit more expensive. But when we look at how much geothermal power is for our total energy grid, we see that geothermal power provides a very small amount of our total energy. And even if we were to greatly increase the amount of geothermal power production, then it would still probably be a small fraction. So we can see here that 11% of our current energy consumption is renewable, and only 2% of that 11% comes from geothermal power. And so, yeah, it's an important sliver, but it's a sliver nonetheless. But still, there are several countries that supply a large portion of their power and electricity from hydrothermal power production. For example, Kenya produces almost half of its electricity from hydrothermal power, and countries like El Salvador, Iceland, and New Zealand also have high proportions of their electricity coming from geothermal energy. So that just about covers everything that we're going to be talking about today. So in summary, we covered the formation of hydrothermal features. We talked about hot springs, geysers, fumaroles, mud pots, and hydrothermal vents. And then we just closed off talking about hydrothermal power. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I will see you all next time.